All right, we can go get started. Hello and welcome to the Important Conversations event series brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Advanced Academic Programs Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Today's event features Zuri Obado speaking on diversity and inclusion in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM. My name is Peter Huggins, and I am the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Important Conversations Diversity, Equity, Inclusion playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Dr. Tristan Cabello.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tristan Cabello. I'm the Associate Director for the Master of Liberal Arts at Johns Hopkins University, but I'm also the co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at Advanced Academic Programs. So the role of the committee, which is comprised of students, faculty, and staff, is to make sure AAP and all of its programs are as diverse, equitable, and accessible and inclusive as they can be. And so this year, the committee has decided to launch a series, a speaker series that we have entitled Important Conversations. The goal of the series is to showcase the work that our administrators and faculty are doing in the field of DEI in the classroom, but also outside the classroom in their professional careers and in their research. So this year, we've been having important conversations about race, gender, class, but also about equity and accessibility in the workplace, for example. Today, I'm particularly happy to have on the show Zuri Obado. Zuri is the interim director for the MS in Biotech Health Science Intensive. And what we are going to do with Zuri today is a bit different. Since the title of our series is Important Conversations, we thought it might be interesting to have actual conversations with our guests. And so today, as we have done in the past, Zuri and I are going to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in her field of studies and what she does with our students here at AAP. So the goal really is for the students to get to know the people that they interact with on a daily basis at Johns Hopkins University a little bit better. So Zuri, it's really a pleasure to have you on our important conversations today. And so my first question to you, of course, is can you tell us more about yourself? Where do you come from? What kind of studies did you do? How did you start your professional career?
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. It is an honor and a pleasure. I guess I'll just start from the beginning. I am of East African descent. My parents are immigrants and immigrated here many years ago. And so I am first generation US citizen and graduate within the US context. I always say I have a lineage of academics. I come from a lineage of academics, but obviously when coming to a new land and having those experiences, it looks a lot different. And so I think a lot of who I am, I would say, has happened somewhat like just out of life experience, like my family's life experiences, but also out of the value sets out of my family. And because there was such a sense and an appreciation for education, I grew up not really even thinking that there was other options besides going to college. And so and with that, I went on to college and I'm from New Jersey and I grew up in New Jersey. And that's where I completed all of my schooling, K through 12, all the way to college. And I went to Rutgers University, where I entered as a pre-med student, interestingly enough, and it's full circle because I work with pre-med students. But I went in with the intention of going into medicine, but through different challenges and then also just having realizations about what I was truly passionate about, and excited about in terms of learning. I ended up majoring in psychology, went on to complete a degree at Boston University School of Medicine and a master's in mental health counseling and behavioral medicine. And since I was headed to be a licensed counselor, and through mentorship, I was really involved in some equity programs that I was also an alumni of through the school. And I returned to New Jersey and just used this program as a way to transition back and try to figure out about licensure. And then I ended up landing in academic advising. And it was like this perfect mesh of being able to be in a place where you're counseling people, but also with a very specific goal. It was very goal oriented. And I really liked that career advising mesh. And so I actually decided not to be a licensed clinician and decided to pursue academic advising and higher education administration much more solidly. And that's what's led me to where I am today. So I worked for Rutgers for about 5 years as a educational opportunity fund, which is an access and equity program for underserved and low income students within New Jersey. And I worked for that program for about 5 years. And then I transitioned to Hopkins, where I focused not just on STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but then more focused on pre-health students. And so the work has continued within career and professional development, but it's definitely specified within the pre-health community. So there's that specificity that I do, particularly in my role at Hopkins.
There's one thing that we talked a little bit during the pre-interview here, and it's this identity of being first gen that sometimes, we don't really talk about. So I'm first gen, you're first gen. And so there's a lot of things that I guess we understand, about each other, even though, each experience is very different. And so one thing that you mentioned, in your profile, on the Johns Hopkins website, and I think also on LinkedIn, is that you are first gen. And so can you tell us, why this is important, to put this identity forward? And also if you have like an example of things that you had to, I guess, overcome, obstacles that came your way, and how did you overcome them? And that may be helpful for our students too.
Yeah, so being first gen is so multifaceted in the sense that there is, for instance, I'll start with the example and then kind of go into the overarching. When I entered the Educational Opportunity Fund program as an incoming freshman, my whole cohort, we all identified as first gen. And what we learned about each other really quickly was it was a predominantly African-American Black identifying group with some Latinx groups. And then we had a few other, but it was predominantly Black students. And we realized how varied our first generational experiences were. Yeah. And one big thing was I had parents who had not lived in America like for most of their even early adulthood, right? So youth to adulthood. And so there were a lot of social cultural dynamics of being African-American or Black within the context of higher ed, particularly, that I was not prepared for. Like, I feel like I didn't have certain conversations with my parents to be able to, even in middle school, I didn't, when a teacher told me that I was smart for a Black girl, I remember having a confusion, should I be offended or was that a compliment? And when I told my parents, they were confused too. So a lot of their experiences with discrimination and things came through my lived experience through the educational system. So we were all learning together, unlike some of my counterparts whose parents had these conversations because there was more historical context about the US context of being Black in America. that I didn't have. And so I would say in one way, I think that there were things I was able to combat, like for instance, imposter syndrome is huge. And I think because I had my parents' vantage point in terms of what education could provide me in the US, I think they equipped me to think about the challenges as opportunities for growth. And I feel like even though sometimes things were difficult, I don't remember having as much feeling that I wasn't supposed to be in the room. Whereas I think there were, especially when I work with my students, there was a lot more grappling about whether or not they can occupy space where they don't see a lot of representation. And then after a while, after you keep experiencing it, now you become very sensitive to it. So I would definitely say being first gen and being able to juggle, like growing up, it felt like when I went home, I went to Africa. And then when I left it, I was back in another space. So it was always hard just like juggling the cultural expectations with like the opportunities you had in your school and work environments. I would say it's both beautiful, but also complicated. And it's sometimes hard to.
Yeah, and that's why it makes it's so important, to talk about intersectionality here, because of course your experience, as a first gen was probably very different from any of the other people's experiences here, probably very different from mine, but also one thing that I always tell the students, and I'm sure that you tell them, exactly the same thing, is that your story matters. Your story is different, and your voice, very much matter. And so telling your story is always helpful, to somebody else, in the end. And so thank you for sharing, because that I think is super helpful for the students. How did you become interested in, you mentioned that you talked about this earlier, but how did you become interested in what you do now? That is, helping students who are underrepresented in those fields.
Yeah, I think I always had it in my mind that I wanted to give back to the program that assisted me. So when I went to college and you learn of this grant that is essentially geared towards not just empowering, but giving resources, scholarships, financial aid, they did summer programs where it would prepare you for math classes and things like that. And I participated as a student, and then I was an RA. So I always had I wanted to give back. I tried to do student peer tutoring and mentorship programs and things like that. And I think it just naturally flowed into what I was doing in my career. So when I had the mission of becoming a counselor, I actually wanted to work with children, and particularly those that had experienced traumatic events that impacted their neurological development and things. And when I had an internship where I worked closely with children and family, I realized that I needed to work with a population that had a little bit more autonomy, because I wanted to take all the babies home. And I was like, I'll just take them home. That's my solution. And so I realized I needed a balance where I could empower and support people, but then they were in a place in their life where they could hopefully feel like they can make their own decisions and make difference in their life. And when you work with children, you're really working with other adults, and it makes it really hard. So when I had the opportunity out of grad school to help a program, one of the Access programs at Rutgers, do some program development around mental health awareness and helping them build coping strategies, I realized this was really reinforcing for me. And I think a lot of times when people go to careers, sometimes it's okay, how much money am I going to make? What's the opportunity? But then you get this reciprocated validation about the difference you see that it's making for the people that you're serving. And then you're like, no, I can keep doing this. I want to keep doing this. So I think it's that reinforcing factor that pushed me to really discover ways that I could support diversified groups of students that have varied experiences. Unique to Hopkins, I don't work for specifically a pipeline or a pathway program for underserved, but we naturally get a diversified group of students because it's a post-bacc program. And the beautiful thing about that, I have students who came here for college particularly, so they are still very early in that migration aspect of immigrating here for the purpose of education. I have students who have lived all over the country from very extremely rural, maybe even extreme religious circumstances where they were sheltered, and this is their first time being really exposed to different, backgrounds of people, and they're supposed to work together. So I think it provided an opportunity to invest in a unique group of students. And honestly, it's reinforcing seeing them accomplish their goals. And I always want to be in a place where I can empower others to reach their goals, but then also do the same for those that they serve in whatever capacity they hope to do that. And I think that career advising, academic advising, pre-health advising has just fostered the greatest opportunity to do that for me.
Absolutely. I know that many times you mentioned to me that you were not, faculty at Johns Hopkins, but in many ways, what you do is so much of, what the faculty does, right? Because we always, advise students, on a daily basis. I see my role as a faculty, really as, opening as many doors for the students, and it's often, doors that, of course, depending on where you come from or what's your story, maybe you don't even see, right?
Yeah.
And so those doors, are there. And so it's my job, and it feels like, this is very much, your job too, here to point at those doors, to make sure they see the doors, and to, open them a little, right? And then, I mean, of course, they're on their own, right?
Right.
And so that's a beautiful way, to express, what advising is. And so just to make sure the audience understand what Zuri and I had in mind here was really just an interview in three different categories and three different pathways here. We're going to talk about the personal a little bit. So we've talked about the personal, the biographical here. We're going to talk about also Zuri's professional career next. And in the end, we'll talk a little bit more about the field in general. And so my next question for you here, Zuri, is, well, you already talked a little bit about this, but tell us a little bit more about what your role at Johns Hopkins consists in, on a daily basis. What is it that you do?
So you have the general duties of just understanding the framework of the pre-health professions. And particularly for our program, we focus on students that are pursuing medicine. So that would be allopathic, osteopathic, MDO, podiatry, within those realms. And so what we do, my responsibility is, one, to be well-versed and knowledgeable on pre-health pathways, and making sure that I understand the mechanisms that it takes for students to be successful in pursuing that direction. And then what I do is I figure out how to translate that information in those levels of standards that have been dictated by these national associations, such as the American Medical School Association, and being able to break it down into pieces in a way that the students can then build their profile and be the most competitive student they can be, right? And so we have the academic aspect where they're taking courses that are bolstering and or just continuing to add to their academic voyage. And the whole point is to prove and communicate to medical schools that they are knowledgeable and have the prowess to be able to navigate medical school. But then what we focused on in the health science intensive was the advising component. And Dr. Tan, who had established the program some years back, understood that it wasn't always enough to simply just provide students with coursework, because the medical school preparation process has a lot to do with understanding the medical perspective and building an appreciation for the process, but then also realizing that terms like holistic review are ambiguous. Like, what does that mean? How does someone prepare themselves to be reviewed holistically, right? And so we also want students who come from underrepresented, income limited, underprivileged communities to still have the same opportunities. So we build in things like MCAT prep into the process so that they can too be equipped to be successful in the standardized testings and any other standards of evaluation. So as an advisor, every day throughout the year that they're with us, because it is a 1-year intensive program, we have these checkpoints where we're essentially navigating them to be prepared to apply within the year of graduation and or any future years they choose to apply. And that incorporates doing group advising classes, having individual advising sessions where we are taking what we did in the group and that we communicated, but then making sure we're working on this one-on-one because not everybody's story looks the same. And then we work on a lot of verbal and written communication effectiveness, being able to showcase yourself, tell your story in a communicated in a way that someone, because that application essentially has to speak for them, right? They don't get to talk to the medical school right away, right? So you have to be able to articulate yourself in your application in a way that the schools want to know more, right? And then also we try to demystify the process because there's a lot of bumps and humps that, especially for first gen, low income, underrepresented, there's no forewarning. And next thing you know, you're in this ditch and you're like, well, how do I get out of it? Right. And so we hope that through our advising, which I would say is not like an intrusive advising, but it's a close advising method. We keep tabs. We have checkpoints, like I said. We have certain perks. Of course, we give committee letters and things, but that comes with them also meeting certain expectations and things. So there's a lot of responsibility on the student's part, but it's reciprocated with more investment in being able to help them pursue medicine.
Yeah, and here again, like really, this is how what you do here, is very much like what any other faculty is doing, because this is really also part of. I mean, it's of course, it's very specific for pre-health, but encouraging students to apply to conferences, to a PhD program. When sometimes some students might set limitations for themselves, or might not be aware that they are actually very much capable of doing it.
Right.
And it's just tailoring, or helping people writing a good letter, or how do you write a good letter? How do you write a good CV? How do you write a good abstract? And those things are very formulaic, like just like you said, for pre-health. And it's a lot of people come equipped, with that to graduate school. Others don't, and so it's our work, of course, it's our job to make sure that we, again, open those doors here. And it seems also, Zuri, that you are doing a lot of work in the profession. And for example, I know that you are the co-chair for the National Association of Advisors for Health Profession, for their Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Can you talk a little bit about but two things, the kind of work that you do, and also why is it important to be involved in those organizations?
Yeah, so the National Association for Advisors of the Health Professions is really geared towards providing resources to those serving pre-health students in many capacities. And so it's both it's both the side of pre-health particularly, but then we also communicate with the professional schools themselves. So as an association, we provide resources. We hold, obviously, conferences that help exchange best practices within advising in general, but also within the pre-health area. We try to discuss issues that we see systemically within encouraging certain populations to pursue medicine, and how we at our local institutions could better implement programs that can lead to better pathways and more secure pathways for students to be able to secure these kinds of opportunities. And our Committee of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion is particularly focused on highlighting the conversations in all aspects of the association of justice, of increasing diversity, not just in race and ethnicity, but in skill set and thought and background, and amongst significant communities like LGBTQ+ and things like that. And we want to make sure that each region is supported in being able to provide that both at the professional level and then at the student level. And I would say one of the greatest accomplishments we've had that actually took place during COVID. I mean, COVID somewhat challenged us to think about how to do things interestingly and collectively, virtually, since we couldn't gather together. And one of the big things that we accomplished was gauging a temperature around the thoughts and feelings of cultural competence and awareness. So we started that conversation about what kind of trainings people want to see. And so our committee really gears in starting the conversations and then providing resources so that institutions can, the advisors at institutions can feel well supported in doing that work at their respective institutions. So that's like the main goal.
So we can close, this chapter on your professional path. Can you summarize, synthesize, you already talked a little bit about this, but what's your philosophy, as an advisor? What are your goals? When you have a student that shows up in your office, do you have something in mind? Like what kind of impact, do you want to have on the students, or does it differ? Every situation is different.
No, so I would say I work from two large frameworks, and they can be broken down. So as a counselor, I was drawn to solution-focused counseling. And I am definitely someone who likes to build quick rapport and see what people's goals are and develop a plan and work towards them. So there's that definitely coach side of me. And then I would say that the other side is about transformational leadership. So I value the opportunity to use what I've learned in a way to empower others to make autonomous decisions for their lives, but then move forward to do that, because I can't touch everyone, right? And so the idea is, if I can make an impact and bring clarity to the goals that people have for themselves, they can better serve the people that they feel called to serve. And so it's really more about making sure that it's like the domino effect kind of thing. And so using both of those, having that coach side of me, but also that transformation leadership, I would say I approach my advising with very focused, goal-oriented strategies to push people towards goals that are self-affirming, like in the sense that they're connected to value sets and also personal convictions and passions in a way that allows them to bring impact to the communities that they hope to impact in various ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's a very good, teaching, advising philosophy here. And so to move from that to the state of the field now, I just want to tell also the audience that they can ask questions to you on the chat box, and that we will have, 5-10 minutes maybe at the end to answer those questions. So moving beyond now and up to or into your field of study, what is the state of the field, Zuri? Is diversity actually increasing? Because, you and I, people who work in diversity and inclusion, I mean, we work on all those committees, you are working on committees, and sometimes we don't really see things changing, on the ground. In your field, in pre-health, do you see that things are actually changing? Is, the student body actually diversifying?
I feel like this one is a real hard one because I think that there are good times, and then sometimes there's that, oh man, it doesn't feel like the needle is moving.
Mhm.
I try to look at life at the glass half full most of the time, because I think that I feel like our brains are built to like remember the negative things because we're like processing them, but the positive things. So I do think we have wins in the field, specifically in STEM or STEAM, as people are kind of revamping the acronyms. I would say the numbers say that overall, and I think diversity has to be defined in the context, but if we're talking about increasing underrepresented community individuals in fields where they have generally been underrepresented within STEM, I do think we have accomplished a lot of things. But then you have highlighted conversations like Black Men in White Coats, which is a documentary we did back in January where we shown that. And you realize that in a way we've moved backwards, because the fact that, and I don't have these stats like on the top of my head, right, at pure accuracy, but in 2000, I believe, 17, there were less, like somewhere around 17, there were less Black men being accepted to medical school than back in the 1960s. So I think there's a disconnect, because now it's like, if we've built more pipeline and pathway programs, what is happening? Like, and they're saying that there some of them are getting into college, but then they're not pursuing professional degrees. So I do think that for a long time, even the program that I'm a product of, there was so much concentration on access, but there wasn't as much energy put into equity. And so there's a lot of people who got lost in the process. And so I do think that as conversations start to say what happened, we need to talk about equitable practices that allow the populations who have the most against them the same opportunity to accomplish. And that's top down. I think if we have to work top down and from the bottom up to finally like meet in the middle, because it can't be just from one end. But I'm encouraged because I have I see my students of color particularly getting into medical school and being very happy about the decisions they've made, and then turn around and impact lives and mentor, and you see it. But then when you look at the data at the end of the year and you're like, why, what happened?
Yeah,
Right.
and that's Zuri mentioned a documentary that we showed earlier this year at Johns Hopkins University, Black Men in White Coats, about the need for more Black men to be visible in those medical professions. And so one thing that the documentary really did well is to show, exactly the reasons why, very tangible, diversity is important, And so that's a question that I have for you. If you can synthesize, maybe summarize this, often when we work in those fields, we have to convince people about like, why is this particularly important to have, diversity in such and such program. And so in a program like yours, maybe more than anything else, it's vital. I mean, it's really important. And the documentary, really showed that. Can you explain, why it is important to have diversity in a program like the pre-health program, or to have more diversity in medical school?
Yes. So I think history can show us that when there's only a certain group of experiences and knowledge base at the table, there is a larger group of people who are suffering at the hand of that. And I think that what diversity in all facets does is allow for ingenuity that has the end user in mind. So that's like that like lean startup type of language in entrepreneurship. Like, you don't want to build a solution and then hope it fits the people, right? if you don't have the voices of those that have experienced and lived those circumstances, then really all you're doing is putting band-aids, if not even dealing with the core issue. And so diversity at its bare minimum just allows for there to be a plethora of ideas that meet more people's needs at once, right? Specifically in the health professions, familiarity and even trust and relationship is often, and we know this, we see these in studies, people connect with people who they feel that they can relate to or identify to, and are often more receptive to taking advice or information from. And as people, if we're ignorant to that fact, then we're really doing a disservice to all and everyone. So being a woman of color and being present for students who are of color, I've seen the instantaneous, like, oh my goodness, someone's on my side, even without having an interaction yet, just because I represent something they're familiar with. And I think in that same way, the fields of science, particularly within healthcare, we will literally die as a world if we don't recognize that needs are diverse, and the people who can best meet those needs are those who have experience in them and have shared those identities in various ways. So as an advisor, it's my mission to make sure that the workforce is diversified, and that's in talent and in background, in experience, and things like that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's for all those of us, who go to the doctors, and so the idea here, it's how comfortable do you feel, when that a doctor actually is likely to understand where you come from,
where you come from, speak your language.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very, very important, right? I mean, we've all been in those situations where, you talk to a doctor and you don't really know if he understands. And so that's your health here, so that's really the most important thing that you have. And so if you don't have somebody across the table that you think is understanding what you talk about, well, then you're not really in a good place, right?
Right.
Can you talk more about this documentary that we watched earlier this year, Black Men in White Coats? What really was the most surprising? What was the most interesting to you?
I don't know if I was surprised, but maybe because, I have lived a similar Black experience. And so I saw those things, but I would definitely say, I think what's shocking is how much people have to be convinced that this is an issue.
Yeah.
The fact that it's still a conversation that still has to be had after decades upon decades, about research showing that having diversity in healthcare is important.
That people still don't believe, in like something as simple and established as systemic racism, when one of the first thing that he says in the movie is, what matters the most about your healthcare or the status of your health is your zip code. That was so, I knew that, but the way that was framed and the way that was phrased, was very efficient to me.
Yeah, I think he did an awesome job about telling the story, especially from different vantage points too, because I also think there's a lack of understanding even in subsets of the Black community about why it's important as well, right? And why it's good to foster and mentor and expose very early, because it's not just about, oh, let's just get them into college, but some of these things have to be established really early so that they understand that, like you said, what their zip code has already set them up in a certain way, but there are ways to navigate that and then feel empowered enough to go back and change it, right? So I think the documentary, one, shows many different Black men experiences, because I think it shows the spectrum of Blackness in a beautiful way. and people being first-gen US citizens, some having historical lineages in the United States, and things like that, but all of it being a unified effort to make sure it meets the needs of people who have dedicated their lives, blood, sweat, and tears into the building of this country, and yet have not received the same attention.
So one final question to you, Zuri, is this, are those conversations really happening in your field? Are they still very much on the margins? Because it seems that even for an issue like this one, the underrepresentation of Black men in medical professions, it seems that from the research that I've done online, this documentary was very well welcomed, was as if the conversation was not really happening, as if that was a discourse that was new to the table. Was I misled? Did I misunderstand? Or is that your feeling too?
I think the documentary has been well received. We've also done it with our association, and many found it both insightful, and also I think it brought an understanding about the nuances leading up to the bigger issue that can be easily addressed through grassroots efforts and things like that. I don't know if the conversation is always happening in the places where the biggest decisions are being made. I feel like I almost have a bias because I would say I specifically choose to be in environments where these conversations are happening. So it feels like, so I have like this confirmation bias, like it's happening because I'm in environments where it's happening.
And then you go to a conference in your field and you're like it has happened to me recently. And you realize, not everybody is having those conversations.
No, not everybody's having those conversations. You're like, oh, this is not a thing, right? So I think that when I think about diversity of communication, right? That's why I love the film, because I think it's digestible. I don't think it's controversial because they're talking about their experiences. It's not accusatory. It's like, you can't disagree with my experience, right? I think that's what's powerful about the documentary. It's giving you insight into how Black men feel and how they're navigating these spaces. How could you say, well, that's not your experience? Like, that sounds crazy. So I think that's what's great about that. And then I do think that conversation has to translate into more actionable conversations and deliberate that are actually bringing about change. And that's legislative, that's institutionally, that's, in that.
I mean, the movie was so powerful that I had wished, that all these people, all those students sometimes, or colleagues, when they're telling me, well, there's no such thing as a system of racism, in America. I'm like, that was just in front of your eyes. It was just absolutely beautifully done here and totally convincing, because like the numbers and just the facts, were there. How can you explain that really what regulates your health in America is your zip code, right? I mean, that's it shouldn't be, right? And so
that's a shocking thing. The shocking thing when he talked about the historically Black colleges and universities that were designated to train medical, and then a few were shut down, like even that stat. So then you're like, wait a minute. So then the largest numbers of Black physicians are coming out of how many institutions, right?
Exactly. And so of course, like you see, like and it was well done and very convincing. I mean, it's of course there's the power also of film, right? I mean, like when there are things unfolding like in front of your eyes like this. If you have any question, we have 1 more minute with Zuri here. Zuri and I, we talked about that maybe we would not be able to fill the whole 45 minutes with our conversations, but of course we could last until 7 here. There's one question that I think is like about the mechanics of the program that I think you will answer probably offline. And other than that, if there's no question, I just want to say thank you to Zuri for a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you also for sharing, the documentary and broadcasting it at Johns Hopkins University. That was a wonderful experience. And Marcus Garvey is with us and says thank you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you so much, Zuri, for a beautiful conversation tonight. Thank you all, and we'll see you next month for more events. Bye.